Okay, I think that was the signal for us to start. Sounds like we have sound. So if everyone will find a seat, we'll get started in just a moment. We're going to look at a few passages in Isaiah, but primarily this evening we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. But before we go there, Chandler is going to lead us in prayer.
Bow with me, please. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for all the many blessings you've given us. Thank you for this time in the middle of the week to come together as Christians and learn more about your word and grow stronger in our faith. Thank you for letting your Son down the cross and an opportunity to be in heaven with you. Please be with us tonight and let us understand the things that are spoken and understand them and apply them to our lives. Please help us to grasp and bring these things with us out into the world as we go about the rest of our week. Guide and direct us in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Curtis continues to recover from COVID, and there are others, and we'll make announcements about that at the end of services. But he's been leading us this quarter in a study of Christian evidences. And last week, I filled in by talking about some about fulfilled prophecy, and I want to follow that line of thought this evening. Last week we looked primarily in the book of Isaiah, and this evening we're primarily going to be looking in the book of Daniel. But if you recall from last week, Isaiah, in fact, we see in the book of Isaiah that God himself cites fulfilled prophecy as proof of his existence and his deity. In Isaiah chapter 44, verses 9 through 11, he says, "Remember the former things long past, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it." And we looked at Isaiah chapter 44, verses 6 and 7, where God says, "I'm the Lord, the King of Israel, the Redeemer, the Lord of hosts. I'm the first, the last. There is no God besides me. Who is like me? Let him proclaim and declare it, yet let him recount it to me in order from the time that I established the ancient nation, and let them declare to them the things that are coming and the events that are going to take place." And in fact, I don't think we looked at Isaiah chapter 42, verses 8 and 9 last week, but there God contrasts himself with the impotent idols who, they can't plan anything. They can't carry out anything. They're not able to say what the future holds. But unlike the impotent idols, God is omnipotent. He can plan. He can reveal. He does execute. God says, "I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. Behold, the former things have come to pass. Now I declare new things. Before they spring forth, I proclaim them to you." And so last week we looked at several of the prophecies in the book of Isaiah, especially looking at prophecies. Isaiah is often referred to as the Messianic prophet because of all that he has to say about the Messiah. We saw also that he had things to say about Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13. He had things to say about, from the very beginning of the book in Isaiah chapter 2, talking about the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom that he was going to establish, a kingdom that was not a military kingdom with swords and spears. He talked about the swords being beaten into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks. This wasn't a military kingdom. The leader of this kingdom wasn't going to be a conqueror in the traditional sense, but in fact would be the Prince of Peace, we saw in Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. And that this Prince of Peace, while he was referred to as a child, he was a man. He came in the flesh, although be it by supernatural means. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14 tells us that his birth would be from a virgin. But then this child would be born in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, and the government would rest on his shoulders, and his name would be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of the peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. And so this king was both in the flesh, a child, born of a woman, but also God, the eternal Father, the Prince of Peace. And I want to focus this evening on the kingdom that was referred to in Isaiah chapter 2 and in Isaiah chapter 9. But we're going to look this evening in the book of Daniel, particularly in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8, at what we're told about this Messianic kingdom. And we'll start in Daniel chapter 2. This is probably a very familiar passage to you. This, as you recall, Daniel was among those young men from the royal families who were carried to Babylon in 606 or 605 BC, basically as hostages. The way most world empires worked in ancient times was that when one kingdom wanted to keep another kingdom in line, they would often take some of the princes, the kings, some of his children, and say, we're going to take them to our country and educate them for you. And every year you're going to send us money, and as long as the money gets there on time, your kids will be healthy. If for some reason the money doesn't show up, well, maybe your kids won't be so healthy. And so, but interesting enough, Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, they find favor with the Babylonian king, so that even when the king of Judah crosses Nebuchadnezzar, they don't lose their lives. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar goes back to Judah and takes some 20,000 people captive, including Ezekiel. And within 10 years, when the king of Judah again resists and decides he's not going to pay tribute to Babylon, maybe he can get help from Egypt, that's when Babylon comes back and utterly destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and carries kills most of the people, but carries the rest into captivity, all but a few of the aged, the sick, and Jeremiah, who's given the choice to come to Babylon, but as a hero, because Jeremiah had been prophesying all along that Babylon was going to be God's agent, that Nebuchadnezzar was God's agent, and that Judah, rather than resisting, should submit. Not a popular message in Jeremiah's day. But Daniel is in Babylon, and in Daniel chapter 2, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And you probably remember the circumstances of that dream. He calls, in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 4, he calls together his wise men, and he wants to know what the meaning of this dream is. Chapter 2 verse 1 says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and sleep left him. He couldn't sleep because these dreams were troubling him. And so in verse 3, the king said, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. And in verse 4, the Chaldean spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we'll interpret it for you. So you tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means. But the king replied in verse 5, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. So this isn't just a matter of interpreting the dream, but they have to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was also. And it's interesting with their responses. In verse 7, they answered and they said, let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we'll declare the interpretation. And the king's firm that that's not going to happen. In verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician or conjurer or Chaldean. Basically, their conclusion is that man is incapable of this. Man can't do this. We can't tell you what the dream is and what it means. And in fact, Daniel will see in verse 14 confirms what they've said. Man is not capable of doing this. Daniel says when he's made aware of the situation, Daniel replies with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. And he seeks his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they pray. But in verse 16, let's see. Oh, he requested that, verse 16, he requests for time, and then he and his friends, they pray, asking for compassion from God in verse 18. And in verse 27, I guess is the statement that I was thinking of, where Daniel's expressing to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, as for the mystery for about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, nor conjurers, nor magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it. So Daniel says the same thing that the magicians had said. Man can't do this. But Daniel says in verse 27, however, there is a God in heaven who reveals mystery. Man can't do this, but there is a God who reveals. God can do what man cannot do. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 28 what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions of your mind on your bed. So man can't do this, but God can, and God has revealed this is what your dream was. He said, while you were on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future. And he who reveals the mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me. It's not my ability to predict or know or my wisdom, but it's God who's given this information. He gave it to you, and now he's given me the interpretation. Verse 31, Daniel tells what the dream was. He says, you were looking, and behold, a single great statue. That statue, which was large and extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you. Its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Man can't do this, but God has revealed. This was what your dream was. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't say, no, that's not it. Nebuchadnezzar knows that that's exactly what God had revealed to him. And so Daniel is also going to give the interpretation. But Nebuchadnezzar can be sure of the interpretation because Daniel doesn't just give the interpretation. He first tells Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was. But what's more important to us is what this dream means. Well, Daniel has already said that God is revealing to Nebuchadnezzar what the future holds, what's going to happen in the future. And this is the interpretation in verse 36. This was the dream. Now I'll tell you what the interpretation is. You, O King, King of kings, to whom God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory, wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand. He has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Okay? So, and he's going to go on to refer to Nebuchadnezzar himself as the head of gold, or as Babylon the kingdom, as an empire that represents gold. We're going to see throughout, Daniel talks about the kingdom or the king interchangeably. But here he says, for instance, in verse 39, after you there will arise another kingdom. So it's not just about kings, but it's kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar is the greatest king of the Babylonian Empire. But there's another kingdom that's going to rise in verse 39 that's inferior to you. And then a third kingdom that's inferior to them. And then there's going to be in verse 40 this fourth kingdom that's as strong as iron. And verse 41, it's divided in some ways, but it's tough as iron, and but it doesn't matter whether you're the head of gold, whether you're the arms and chest of silver, whether you're the belly of bronze, or whether you're the legs and feet of iron. None of that makes a difference. All of these things are going to pass away. A stone is going to strike. all these kingdoms are going to be blown away. But this stone is going to grow into a mountain. There, you and 3 other kingdoms following you are temporary. You may last for centuries, but you won't last. But there is a kingdom that will last, that will have no end. And we'll see more about this kingdom in Daniel chapter 7. But first I want to look at Daniel chapter 8. Because we know that this first kingdom is Babylon, the head of gold. But and we know the second kingdom already, right? Because we looked at Isaiah chapter 13 last week. In Isaiah chapter 13, who was God going to use to bring an end to Babylon? The Medes and the Persians. And so Isaiah, a century and a half before Daniel, has already made that clear. But in Daniel chapter 8, we see that Daniel is the one who's having a vision now, not the king. And in Daniel chapter 8, verse 3, he says, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but the one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Daniel was going to go on to say in Daniel the 8th chapter, again, not only what this vision was that he had, but in fact, Daniel was going to receive a divine interpretation of what this vision represented. In verse 15, we're told, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And as I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. So he came near to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand the vision pertains to the time of the end. And although he says the time of the end here in verse 17, notice in verse 23, he refers to this same time as the latter period of their rule. That is, these kingdoms. It's the end of these kingdoms, not the end of the world. But it's this latter period of time of their rule, of these 2 kingdoms that he's talking about here. And now, verse 18, now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and made me to stand upright. And he said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur in the final period of indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Verse 20, the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay? So we don't have to guess who this ram is. We're told this ram is the kings of Media and Persia. And so while it's here represented in Daniel chapter 8 as a ram, remember back in chapter 2, the kingdom that was going to follow Nebuchadnezzar was represented as silver. And so there it's part of a silver statue, gold head, silver arms. It's pictured as a statue. But here he's being pictured as an animal. And so a ram with 2 horns. Why 2 horns? Well, my guess would be Medes and Persians. I mean, the point is that Cyrus was a Persian who united the Medes and the Persians. They had for centuries been at conflict with one another. But it's Cyrus who unites them, and as a result of that is able to defeat Babylon. But this is during the time. This is during the during the time when Belshazzar is king, when Daniel has this vision. And he's told that this ram is going to come, Media Persia is going to come. But he's not only being told that Media Persia is going to defeat Babylon, but we're being told here who's going to defeat Media and Persia a couple centuries after that. Greece. And, that's pretty familiar from a history book, right? We read about the wars between the Persians and the Greeks. But in fact, we're told in verse 21, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. So we don't have to guess, we're told. And so Daniel, during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, at the time of world domination by Babylon, is being told that, after you, Media and Persia is going to be defeated by Greece. Well, Media and Persia hasn't even taken power yet. But Daniel is being told before they even take power who they're going to lose power to. And we're told that this Greek kingdom empire has this large horn between the first king, and who of course is the first king of the great united Greek empire, Alexander the Great. I mean, before that you have lots of city-states and again a divided group that is united under one leader. And Alexander, in 12 years, between 332 and 321 BC, that's all he lives. In just over a decade, he, from Greece, will defeat the Persians throughout all of Asia Minor, will go into Egypt and liberate Egypt, will go on to defeat the Persians in their own empire in the original area of the Medes and the Persians, conquer the territory of Babylon that they had been taken by the Medes and the Persians, will go on to India. He comes back to Babylon, is contemplating rebuilding Babylon, which you'll remember Isaiah said would never be rebuilt. And at 33 years of age, he mysteriously dies. 33 years old, in the peak of his health, as he plans to do something God said wasn't going to be done. And instead of him doing it, he dies. And when he dies, there's nobody as strong and capable to lead the Greeks as he is, and so his kingdom is basically divided between four of his generals. And so this great horn is going to be removed and replaced with four horns that represent four kingdoms which will arise. And so now we're not only looking past the Medes and the Persians to the Greeks, but we're looking at the end of the Greek Empire and how this part of the world is going to be divided between, well, you've got the main body of Greece that's going to ultimately be ruled by Cassander. You've got the Asia Minor portion that's going to be ruled by Lysimachus. Neither one of those are really going to be important to Judah. What's going to be important to Judah is the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And why that's going to be important to Judah is because they're right in the middle of those two. And from about 320 BC to 150 BC, there's this constant struggle between Syria and Egypt over who's going to control the area between them, where Judah is located, where Jerusalem is located, where the exiles who have returned from Babylonian captivity have come and rebuilt the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. And oftentimes the Jews will try to play one against the other. You see who's going to give them the best deal. The Seleucids promise, if you serve us, we'll lower your taxes. And the Egyptians promise, no, if you serve us, we'll give you lower taxes. And there's the carrot, and there's also usually a stick, and there's cajoling and various things to try to keep that territory under submission by both the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. But again, this is 6 centuries before Christ, And Daniel was talking about what's going to happen 3 centuries before Christ, 300 years later. And so, again, as both the magicians, the wise men, and Daniel said, man is incapable of knowing this. Daniel only knows this because God reveals this. Idols can't do this, but the God in heaven can do this. And again, as I mentioned from last week, you're going to have to feel free to stop me, to make comments, to raise questions. It just amazes me. And I mean, it's a lot of biblical scholars look at the prophecies in the book of Daniel, and their conclusion is that they are so accurate, they conclude not that this must have been revealed by God, but they have to. Their conclusion is, well, Daniel must have lived after it happened, and he's writing about events after they happened, because nobody could describe in this detail what happened before it happens. After, it's easy to say this. This is who's going to win the game after it's over, but before, it's a different story. So let's look then at Daniel chapter. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 7. And this goes back to, so in Daniel chapter 8, we're really focused in on the second and third kingdoms that were going to follow Babylon. The chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze. But in Daniel chapter 7, we're going to go back to looking at all 4 of the kingdoms. And here all 4 of the kingdoms are described as animals. And Daniel chapter 8, the Medes and Persians in the Greeks were described as a ram versus a goat. But here in Daniel chapter 7, these 4 kingdoms that were described as gold, silver, bronze, iron, are now going to be described as a lion, a bear, a leopard, and something terrible. Don't know what it is, but it's so terrible we don't even have a name for it. Let's just call it a monster. But in Daniel chapter 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, verse 1, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed, and then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And the 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and I was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind also was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and the 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And they said, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. And the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And after this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth, and it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. Behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boast. I kept looking until the thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. You might think about the scene described in Ezekiel, the first chapter, as Ezekiel sees the appearance of the vision of the glory of God on his throne, or the throne scene in the book of Revelation in Revelation chapter 4. But we're told here that in verse 11, I kept looking because the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed, and given to the burning fire. So this fourth beast is going to be destroyed, like it's going to pass away just as the kingdoms before it. But notice Daniel says in verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of the heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And so just as in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was told about 4 kingdoms that were going to pass away and be replaced by a kingdom that would endure forever, we see Daniel having the same message repeated to him, that there are going to be 4 kingdoms, and we've identified already, of course, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and even poor history students probably know which empire followed the Greek Empire, right? The Roman Empire. And as many have said, while the Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, in many ways the Greeks conquered the Romans culturally. In many ways the Romans just adopted much of Greek culture. They pretty much took their Greek gods and just changed their names from Zeus to Jupiter, from Hera to Juno, from Hermes to Mercury, from Diana to Aphrodite. But the point is not these kingdoms. Babylon fades into importance. We struggle to remember who ruled in Babylon and anything really about those leaders. I mean, we can look in the museums at things that have been recovered by the archaeologist. We can see inscriptions on the side of the mountain that Cyrus and Darius and others placed there to commemorate their feats. Like I say, that much of Greek culture still permeates even our society today. Western culture has greatly been influenced by the Greeks and the Romans. But all of those kingdoms have passed. They've been defeated. But there's only one kingdom that endures, that's been given dominion and glory and honor, a kingdom that's made up of all peoples and nations. Does that remind you of anything in Isaiah chapter 2? That all nations would flow into it? Or in Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6, that God wasn't just going to save Jacob, but all the nations? Or even what God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Not only am I going to bless you, make a great nation, but through you all nations will be blessed. And so we see that these beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, this terrifying, terrible fourth beast. And it's interesting, just like you think of gold in the statue. The lion is kind of the gold standard of animals, the top of the food chain. And a little inferior to that, gold is silver, maybe a little lower than the lion is the bear. Might make an interesting fight if you were to watch that, but I wouldn't want to see it. The third kingdom, as Nebuchadnezzar saw in the statue of bronze, represented here as a winged leopard. In chapter 8, it was represented as a goat, right? But here it's represented as a winged leopard. Think about that as Alexander conquers the known world in 11 years. Not just a leopard with wings. And then this dreadful, terrible, powerful, iron teeth empire, unlike even Babylon, Persia, and Greece in some ways, it's going to last not a century and a half or 2 centuries. It's going to last 5 centuries. But 2 centuries, 5 centuries, it's temporary. The kingdom that Daniel sees is a kingdom that's going to last longer than 5 centuries, longer than 5 millennia. It's eternal. This king will never be destroyed. This kingdom will never be destroyed. Even though we're going to see in Daniel chapter 7 that it is going to face some difficult times. And Daniel is going to describe those difficult times 6 centuries before they occur. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 16, Daniel says, I approached one of those who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. You know, a lot of people postulate and make up all kinds of wild things about this. But we don't have to guess, because Daniel asked, what does this mean? And it's going to be revealed. Right here we're told what it means. Who are these animals? What is this horn, in verse 17, these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. Or as he's going to say in verse 34, when he talks about the 4th one, he says the 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom. So again, this idea of king and kingdom used interchangeably, although a kingdom often has more than one king. But oftentimes you associate Babylon, you think of Nebuchadnezzar. Persia, you think of Cyrus. Greece, you think of Alexander the Great. Rome, probably Caesar is what comes to mind, because they all refer to themselves as Caesars. But if there's one in particular that stands out, whether it's Augustus or whether it's Nero, who was so dominant in the middle of the 1st century, or whether it's one of the later, this 10th or 11th ruler in the 4th kingdom. But it's interesting what we're told about this individual. These 4 kingdoms. He says in verse 18, but the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Now that's interesting. Here in this verse, we're told that this kingdom that was going to be established and last forever, that's going to be established, if you remember back in Daniel chapter 2, was going to be established in the time of that 4th empire. In the time of that Roman Empire, God was going to establish an eternal kingdom. And we see that of this Roman Empire, that this kingdom that was going to be established during their time of political control on the earth was going to be composed of saints. Saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Verse 19, then I desired to know the exact meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, which devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth, uttering great boast, which was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. And so, although God established a kingdom during the days of the Romans that was going to be an eternal kingdom, we see that one of these Roman kings was going to wage war with the saints until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints and of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So not only has Daniel told us that God is going to establish an eternal kingdom, and it's going to be established during the time of the Romans, but he tells us also that the Romans are going to persecute the saints who make up this kingdom. And although it may look like the saints are going to be overpowered, Rome is going to be judged, and the saints are going to be victorious. So long before John pens Revelation, Daniel has the same message. Daniel has the same message. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints and of the highest one. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones. He will subdue 3 kings, and he will speak out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times and a half a time, but not permanently. Verse 26 says, But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty and the dominion and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. Daniel says here in this passage in verses 13 and 14 that there's an eternal kingdom that's going to endure forever. And he says it again in verse 18. And he says it again in verse 27. 3 times in this one chapter, he says, there's a kingdom that's coming that's going to have no end. We're a part of that kingdom. To him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all the peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Verse 14. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Verse 18. The sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms of the whole earth will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. Verse 27. Think about this. Think about Daniel's prophecies. God's message, first to Nebuchadnezzar, later to Daniel. Not just parlor trick, not just to indulge idle curiosity. I mean, certainly it's going to serve as evidence later for people's faith. You know, God had cited prophecy as an evidence of the fact that he is God and he alone is God and he is who he says he is. But think about when Daniel's message is being penned. He's a hostage in a foreign land. He's in exile. The nation's in exile. How are God's promises to Abraham ever going to be fulfilled, Scott?
Well, I was just going to say, his prophecies are so accurate that the liberal scholarship now says he must have written this book. Wasn't written by Daniel back in Babylon. It must have been written about 200 BC because he's so accurate. I mean, that's the fringe of scholarship. That's not, conservative scholarship, which attributes him to, writing at the time of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. But it's just astonishing, again, how accurate he was.
Yeah, and when you get to looking at the prophecies in chapter 11 and 12 about the specific events that are happening in the 2nd century before Christ with the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and basically the Maccabees and that period of history. Again, it is so accurate that no scholar questions the accuracy of the events. The only thing that they can do is say, well, that didn't get penned 6 centuries before Christ. It had to have that. that's so accurate that it had to be written after the fact. But there's plenty of evidence that it was written well before that. I mean, there are points in the book of Daniel that had been forgotten by 2 centuries before Christ, just as there are lots of things about ancient history that we've forgotten, but that archaeologists come along and look and say, oh, yeah, we found out this information that had kind of slipped away. Well, we've recovered. We found out that, Nabonidus wasn't the last king of Babylon. People thought for a long time he was the last king of Babylon, and they made fun of this Belshazzar person that was supposed to be the last king in the book of Daniel, until they found out that Nabonidus had a son, Belshazzar, and that Nabonidus was more interested in religion than politics, and then he left his son in charge of the capital of Babylon to take care of political things while he went off to a temple to worship. And then it becomes pretty clear why Belshazzar would say to Daniel, whoever interprets this writing on the wall will become the third ruler of the kingdom. Not second, but third. But it's got us exactly right. I mean, the accuracy, and even, the minute detail about Jewish history, what's going to occur in the Jews with the high priesthood and with the desecration of the temple and the efforts of Antiochus Epiphanes to try to basically exterminate Judaism before Christ even arrives. But as Isaiah said, God said through Isaiah, I have a plan, and I will execute my plan. Man won't thwart my plan. I was going to say, I haven't been watching the clock. I don't even have a clock. What are we looking like on time? Okay, I figured it probably was. Appreciate so much your attention, and we'll hope that Curtis is feeling better by next week, but if not, we'll probably look at some more prophecy. So, I've been marveling as we've been looking in the book of Acts how often we're told that they studied the scriptures. Well, what scriptures did they study? The scriptures were Isaiah and Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. All right, we'll have a song and an invitation here in just a moment. Thank you.